Hi there everyone! Welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Carol Pateman on Patriarchy. Or you could also say The Sexual Contract, which is the name of the book that we're reading these small excerpts from. Pateman's work is really interesting, really fascinating. I know I start out every one of these lectures by saying that, but I think it's really interesting, and I think it's really interesting in part because she's a really astute scholar of political theory, and she is unearthing a dimension of political theory. Specifically, we're going to talk about the social contract theory that I think is, from a historian's standpoint, like completely undeniable. Like, as far as she is talking about, the specific figures such as Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and so on, she's absolutely characterizing them correctly. And this is really kind of damning, right? Because if you know anything about social contract theory, then you likely know that it is really the foundation of United States civil law, civil conception of itself, political theory of itself, right? And so too with a great very many other of European and non-European countries. This was accepted for a long time, and to some degree still is, I think, as a framework for thinking about the relationship that you have to a political body that governs you, right? So let's get into it. So Pateman is trying to make a point about social contract theory, right? And you might be familiar with some of these names from other classes, or you might not. Either way is totally okay, right? But here are just three names to throw out: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These were all European philosophers of the early modern period. And one thing about early modern Europe, I teach classes in early modern European philosophy, so I talk about these kind of guys a lot. But one thing that's very interesting about that period of European history is just the amount of civil conflict, right? There was constant, unending civil war, right? Both in England and abroad. And there was a sort of crisis of faith. There was sort of more and more civil conflict was generated from religious differences. And so really, I think European intellectuals turned their attention to the question of legitimate political authority precisely because they were at this moment of like intense civil crisis, right? And in fact, the sort of crisis that was the lead up to, in a way, our new modern world, right? Where we have nation states. So like the American Revolution, and I think ultimately, more importantly, the French Revolution were really, really modeled on these theories about political right going on at the time. And the basic idea goes like this, right? So you're having this problem, you're having civil turmoil, you're having religious disagreements, and you're trying to find some strategy for figuring out who has legitimate political authority, right? Who should you listen to? If two lords are in dispute, say about a territory or something like that, right, then you immediately have a problem about political authority. And if you're somewhere like the Holy Roman Empire, then there's nothing like a national government to adjudicate that dispute. So as a consequence, the way that the feudal world operated, it was very, very important to figure out how to adjudicate these conflicts, especially as we were talking about previously, with the emergence of early forms of capitalism and industrialization, right? It's really, really necessary to keep the gears going, right? So social contract theory is sort of like a branch of political theory that is interested in this question of legitimate political authority, and thinks that if you want to understand what constitutes political or legitimate political authority, then you need to look towards mutual benefit, right? So their model is the contract, right? When you enter a contract, they're oftentimes thinking about a business contract, but as we'll see, there are also sort of family contracts, right? Then you're envisioning a relationship that each party enters into of their own will, because this situation is mutually satisfactory and to the benefit of each, right? And so this is where you get a lot of ideas that are really, really vital and important to liberal democracy, right? That the state governs on behalf of its citizens, not at the behest of some ruler that, is supposedly like holy or something like that. This is the beginning of liberal political democracy, but it also, I think, represents many of the shortcomings and limitations of this tradition, which is why some people have found it necessary to expand the social contract tradition and to think more robustly about issues about, for example, distributive justice, than any of these thinkers really attended to in the early modern period. But then there are also some figures, and I think Pateman is closer to here, that think that we need to abandon the social contract approach entirely as like a model for legitimate political authority. Of course, there are lots of different answers to the question. Well, if you don't have a social contract theory, well, how do we do political theory instead, right? That's very open-ended, right? But let's focus for now on the problems that people might see in this approach that you can see really, really clearly in the case of the oldest proponents of this approach. And Pateman thinks, arguably, even in more contemporary versions of this kind of theory. And so if you want to understand the project of the social contract theory, then you have to talk about the strategy, right? How do you demonstrate that legitimate political authority comes from or causes or issues from the mutual benefit of each party? And the strategy in general was to explain the benefit of belonging to civil society instead of what they called a state of nature, right? And generally, what these philosophers, political theorists had in mind by the idea of the state of nature is a state outside of any legitimate political authority. So how things would be, if there wasn't a United States government with a jury system and all of that, like a whole criminal justice system, what would our relations with one another be like if we lived in a society like that? And the social contract theorists offer a range of answers. Thomas Hobbes thought that would be horrible. He described life in the state of nature as nasty, brutish, and short. So Hobbes thought that it was immensely to everyone's benefit to enter into civil society and to get out of the state of nature, and therefore thought of political authority as really issuing from how bad it is, right, to live without the law. So Hobbes's theory was very, in a way, kind of permissive towards the state. The state had a lot of rights with respect to you because it's providing you with such a great good simply by protecting you from the state of nature. John Locke's John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are different from Hobbes insofar as they really thought that the state of nature wasn't quite as bad as Hobbes was characterizing. Each thought, for different reasons, that it was important to leave the state of nature and enter civil society. But because they didn't think that the state of nature was so bad, they thought that the state had more obligations on the part of people to make it beneficial to enter civil society. So Locke and Rousseau are interesting because you can kind of think of them in a way. Locke as the forefather of the American Revolution, and Rousseau as the forefather of the French Revolution. Each of them argued that it was right to rebel against the state if they failed to make certain kinds of obligations towards the people. Locke was really interested in property rights and stuff like that, right? Enforcement of the law, right? Rule of law stuff. And Rousseau was really interested in issues of equality and distribution of goods and services that should take place within a legitimate political society. So, maybe I think we could even say that the French Revolution is in some way more important than the American Revolution in terms of its impact in world history. And the reason why is because the American Revolution was a revolution of a colony against its, supposed home country or whatever, right? There was no radical change in social class. There was no argument against an extension of political authority in general. It was just sort of like, hey, England, you are, failing to make this mutually beneficial to us, so we're going to rebel and form our own civil society, right? Fair enough. But the structure of, basically what had been set up by England continued to remain there. So even though there was in some way a revolution, that revolution didn't have any consequences in terms of how America organizes class society. The French Revolution was much more significant in the sense that it involved the ousting and killing of a number of aristocrats and the formation of forms of government where it's explicitly acknowledged that the state has expansive obligations to the people, right? So this is sort of the legacy of social contract theory, right? It on the one hand, it's trying to legitimize state authority, but in doing so, it's setting rules for that. And in setting rules for that, you're describing also situations in which the state can fail to make their relationship to you mutually beneficial. And therefore, they were also, at least in the case of Locke and Rousseau, theorists of bourgeois revolution, right? Theorists of a certain kind of social class ousting their aristocratic betters, right? So that's all well and good. That's just an explanation of what social contract theory is. Now let's start talking more specifically about Pateman's critique of this theory. Because the outline that I've just provided is maybe the sort of thing that I think that you would typically hear in any sort of philosophy or political science or sociology or anything like that, discussion of political authority for the period. But what Pateman points out in the sexual contract is that there's a whole nother dimension to the social theory, namely how this social theory thinks about sex and gender and sexuality that is usually entirely swept under the rug. In being swept under the rug, what he means is that the whole basis of the strategy of the social contract theory is to explain this transition from nature to culture And all of these theorists thought about this in gendered, sexed ways, right? So part of Pateman's analysis is to say, in some respect, that the social contract, which is a contract between the state and, you could say, a kind of quintessentially masculine head of household, is founded on a sexual contract that takes place between some ways that you might put it would be a contract between a man and his wife, but you might also say a contract between a husband and the father of the groom, right? A contract essentially between men, a contract that essentially concerned kinship relationship, lineage, right? And involved the transfer, right, of women who are subject to a kind of political authority from one to the other. So in the same way that all of the social contract theorists thought that the social contract described a situation of legitimate political authority, they thought that exactly because they modeled it on what they considered to be the sexual contract, the contract between the sexes, right? Or the contract to exchange a woman between a husband and the father of the groom, right? In which case, women are in effect the property of men, right? And I think that Pateman believes that this can provide us the foundations for a rigorous feminist conception of what patriarchy involves. So we've talked a lot about, and Beauvoir especially gave us reason to talk about, how the philosophical tradition has conceived of women as kind of the other of men, right? All of the social contract theorists envision themselves as talking to, writing philosophy for, writing political theory for men, for heads of household. And it described their relationship to the state. But obviously, if you're talking about a family unit, you're talking about a head of household, you're talking about a father, then there has been a prior kind of sociality, a kind of sociality that these thinkers think of as natural, the family, that is a social structure that exists prior to the emergence of the social contract. So the family is given as an example of a social institution of legitimate political authority that is rooted fundamentally in nature, right? That men have certain kinds of natural qualities and women have other natural qualities. And that these qualities about men and women justify a hierarchical social division where men control the public sphere of the family. They are the representative of the family to the public. When decisions are to be made about the household's relationship to the state or to other families, as in the case of, complex kinship relationships, then the man is to be consulted. Whereas women are seen as their authority rests in the private sphere, in the rearing of children, in aspects about the child's education, and of course going through the process of pregnancy and actually bearing children. So nature is seen as womanly, and women are seen as natural. They are by nature inferior to man. They are by nature consigned to a secondary position in social structure. And the relationship between husband and wife, for all of these thinkers, is fundamentally asymmetrical. in the vein as Beauvoir was discussing, as we discussed previously. And so the institution of the family that subtends the social contract, and who founds the social contract, is based on this relationship between the sexes. And so Pateman thinks that now she's given a really, really rigorous genealogical feminist analysis of how it is that social contract theorists sort of bake in sexism to their very kind of political theory, right? Their whole political theory is envisioned on this transition from nature to culture, which is first kind of initiated in family structure, which taken to be natural in the domain of women, and the domain of the private sphere, and the sexual contract. And so it's baked into the theory in a way that we absolutely do not ever discuss in any context, almost outside of a WGSS class, that all of this theory is assuming a conception of the family that they take to be purely natural, right? And obviously all of the feminist analysis that we have discussed in this class up to this point gives us reason to be intensely skeptical of that, right? And also, therefore, I think intensely skeptical of this entire structure, right? Because here, just as Wittig showed in her analysis of structuralism, so too I think Pateman shows in her analysis of the social contract theory how women are, in a patriarchal system, the property of men, whether those men be her husband or her father, right? Hence, the problem of women will often concern women who are not directly controlled by men, such as widows or lesbians. And so, if this is our conception of what patriarchy is, then it's important to recognize that patriarchy therefore has two aspects to it. Two aspects that are, in a way, interconnected and linked in our society. A paternal conception of patriarchy and a fraternal conception of patriarchy. So obviously, the word patriarchy is related to this ancient Latin word, right? Pater, which means father, right? And so the root of patriarchy is always going to refer to a patriarch, who is a father. And this is a lot of the time how we think about what patriarchy is. We think of patriarchy as something like the rule of fathers over their family. And feminism has very often offered a critique of patriarchy that essentially targets this paternal conception of patriarchy. But part of the effect of Pateman's argument is intended to draw our attention to an aspect of patriarchy that we very often ignore because of the etymological connection of patriarchy to fathers, and that is fraternal patriarchy, right? Patriarchy between brothers. What does this mean? Well, very often, social contract theorists have tried to argue that the social contract theory offers a non-patriarchal political theory. And if you think about the king as being someone like a father, which is actually how the sort of aristocratic political theorists prior to the social contract theorists thought about it, then you might think that the way to solve patriarchy is to enforce the rule of law, It's to get rid of the special authority that certain kinds of people, paradigmatically fathers, especially old men, have over others. And so what we need is really an expansion of the role of civil society. Pateman, I think, wants to draw our attention to more radical conclusions. In particular, she wants to subvert this tendency on the part of the social contract theorists to think that they're anti-patriarchal by pointing to how patriarchy can actually be entirely maintained within the law, within the framework of deliberative, liberal, democratic rules that we could think of as being analogous to the rules that you would assign, say, between brothers on account of the fact that they are equals, right? In the way that citizens, which for a long time meant only heads of household and therefore only men, are part of civil society. So if patriarchy is not just paternal, it's not just the despotic power of a tyrant, right, deciding for others without rules, but it also can actually be conferred and constructed and operationalized within rules, within the law, even within a law that appears at the surface level to be equalizing, it can nevertheless function to preserve this structure of patriarchy, this structure where women are consigned entirely to the private sphere and are considered secondary and inadequate in comparison with men. I'm very, very interested to hear what you all think about Pateman's expansive conception of patriarchy and her criticism of the social contract theory. Do you agree with her that we should abandon all of our attempts to justify political authority through the social contract? Do you think that this framework can be saved somehow? If so, how? I'm very interested in knowing what you think in this week's discussion forum. I'll see you in the next video.